Hi, welcome to my talk. Today I'll talk about durational cues to stress and phrasing in post-vocal context in English. I should mention that the paper I submitted was based on a pilot study for this experiment, and recently I just finished the full experiment with more items and more subjects. So I'll be presenting the results of the full experiment in this talk. So this is the roadmap of the talk. Let's jump right into the introduction. In English, there's a phenomenon called post-vocal deaccenting that refers to the fact that words following narrow focus are deaccented. Take 1B as an example. 1B is a broad focus sentence as an answer to what has happened. In this sentence, I highlighted the words that can carry pitch accent. They are Freddy, over, and problem. Among them, problem carries nuclear accent, which refers to the strongest pitch accent in a sentence. This contrasts with 2B, which is narrow focus. So Freddy here is focused, and that is the only word with pitch accent here. F0 falls after Freddy and remains low and level through the rest of the sentence. A simple analysis of this fact posits that focus must be marked by nuclear accent. Since nuclear accent is the last pitch accent in a phrase, therefore no pitch accent follows focus. In this talk, I will use post-vocal deaccenting as a test ground for two separate research questions. Let me go over each one. The first one is pitch accent the only way to realize prominence in English? Another candidate for realizing prominence is phrasal stress. So can pitch accent be distinguished from stress? Bollinger has argued that no, there should be no phrasal stress distinctions without pitch accent. On the other hand, other people have argued that pitch accent should be distinguished at least from word level stress. But the question remains about phrasal stress. Post-vocal contexts are a good test ground due to deaccenting. Assuming the absence of post-vocal accent, if we can find cues to phrasal stress or prominent post-vocally, then we can say phrasal prominence may exist independently of pitch accent. To preview the result, with the removal of pitch accent, we can't find prominence distinctions post-vocally. The second research question has to do with phrasing and pitch accent. It has been argued by Beckman that every intermediate phrase must contain at least one pitch accent. So say 1B is the broad focus sentence we saw earlier. And for instance, this is the phrasing of intermediate phrase. So the parentheses indicate intermediate phrase boundaries. Then the second research question we can ask is, can an intermediate phrase exist without any pitch accent? That is Beckman right? If she is right, then the fact that there is no pitch accent after focus implies that there is no intermediate phrasing post-vocally, and post-vocal material should phrase with the focus. As in 2B, once we put narrow focus on Freddy, none of the following material has pitch accent. And since every intermediate phrase must have at least one pitch accent, we have no choice but to put the entire sentence into one phrase. But if Beckman is wrong and we can see an intermediate phrase without pitch accent, then we may see intermediate phrasing post-vocally, like in 2'B. Here, we have an intermediate phrase that contains no pitch accent. So we know independently that an intermediate phrase has pre-boundary lengthening effects. That is, the last rhyme before an intermediate phrase boundary is lengthened. So take 1B as an example. Say this is the way intermediate phrases are phrased. Then over, the second rhyme of over should get lengthened due to preceding an intermediate phrase boundary. This then makes a prediction for post-vocal context. If there is post-vocal dephrasing, such pre-boundary lengthening effects should disappear. because in 2b, there is no intermediate phrase after over anymore. Therefore, we shouldn't see the second rhyme of over be lengthened. To preview the result, contrary to this prediction, I will show that such pre-boundary lengthening effects still exist post-focally, which indicates that intermediate phrasing is maintained. Therefore, 2'B should be the correct analysis because I do observe pre-boundary lengthening effects on over. And here, an intermediate phrase does contain no pitch accent contra Beckman. So the experiment looks for evidence of phrasing and phrasal stress post-focally by putting syntactic structures that are usually distinguished by accentuation and phrasing patterns in a post-focal context. Then we can see if they continue to be distinguished post-focally. So the first step is to identify a suitable syntactic distinction that has this prosodic distinction. In English, thinking over is ambiguous between verb and particle as in 3 and verb and preposition as in 4. And I think observed in the literature that these two syntactic structures generate different prosodies. So I confirmed that under broad focus, these prosodic differences are real. So my observations are consistent with the literature. Specifically, the particle has a pitch accent in 5, whereas the preposition in 6 doesn't. And this pattern is reversed for the verb, which tends to carry a pitch accent in verb and preposition, but not in verb and particle. In terms of prosodic boundary, the boundary between the verb and the particle is smaller than the boundary immediately following the particle. I use the vertical line to indicate the stronger boundary in the V to P domain. And this relation is reversed, for 6. Here, the stronger boundary is between the verb and the preposition. And what exactly is this stronger boundary? I think it is an intermediate phrase because there tends to be a phrase accent, specifically L-, that's aligned with this stronger boundary in both 5 and 6. So since we know independently that accentuation creates lengthening effects, and also phrasing has pre-boundary lengthening effects, I will verify these lengthening effects on the relevant rhymes under broad focus. And the research questions I raised earlier can be answered by checking whether these lengthening effects are maintained under narrow focus. So let me quickly go over the methods. I used 80 target sentences varying by 2 syntactic conditions we saw earlier and 2 focus conditions, broad focus and narrow focus. I used 73 filler items and they were all randomized and there were 13 native speakers participating in the study. So as I go over the results, I will go over the predictions and analysis as well as the results for question 1 and question 2 separately. Before doing that, let's clarify some terminology. All the verbs, prepositions, and particles I used in this experiment are disyllabic and trochaic. So I use V1 to refer to the first or stressed rhyme of the verb, and V2 is the last, second, or unstressed rhyme of the verb. P1 then refers to the stressed rhyme of the word that's ambiguous between particle and preposition, and P2 refers to the last or second rhyme of this word. Independently, we know that the rhyme of an accented syllable is longer than the rhyme of an unaccented syllable. So recall the pitch accent patterns we saw earlier. We then predict that because in verb and preposition, the verb carries a pitch accent, but it doesn't in verb and particle, then under broad focus, V1 should be longer in verb and preposition than in verb and particle. And the reverse should be true for P1. And to answer the first research question, we should see whether these lengthening distinctions are maintained post-focally. Because if they are, then we say phrasal stress can be distinguished from pitch accent, and we still see prominence distinctions postfocally. So to test this hypothesis, I used two linear mixed effects models. They both have syntax and focus and their interaction as the fixed effects, and subject and item as the random effects. And here, each model has the duration of V1 and P1 as the dependent variable, respectively. So to test the research question, I code focus as, I dummy coded focus with 0 being narrow and 1 being broad. So then the main effect of syntax would indicate that whether under narrow focus, there is a significant distinction between these two syntactic structures, which is what we're looking for in the research question. To show you the results, the prediction is under broad focus. Just to verify, V1 is longer in verb and preposition than in verb and particle. And this is indeed true. And this difference is significant, as is shown in this graph. Then the research question asks about postfocal context. If phrasal stress can be distinguished from pitch accent, then the same pattern should hold for postfocus. However, we didn't find a significant difference in the V1 duration between these two syntactic conditions. Therefore, there's no evidence for postfocal prominence on the stressed verb rhyme. I should also say that V1 is on average 6.8 milliseconds shorter postfocally than in broad focus, comparing just across focus conditions. Now looking at P1. So under broad focus, the prediction is P1 should be longer in verb and particle. And this prediction is indeed borne out for broad focus. P1 is 10.6 milliseconds longer in verb and particle. So if phrasal stress can be distinguished from pitch accent, the same pattern should hold for post-focus, but we didn't find any significant difference there. Therefore, there's no evidence for post-focal prominence on the stressed P rhyme. Again, there's a significant difference between focus conditions. Post-focal material on general is 22 milliseconds shorter than in broad focus. So now let's look at the predictions and analysis for the second research question. We know independently about this pre-boundary lengthening effects. That is, the final rhyme of a word is lengthened before a boundary, and the bigger this boundary, the longer the rhyme. So this makes the following prediction. Recall that under broad focus, in verb and particle, the boundary after P2 is greater than the boundary after V2, which predicts that P2 should be lengthened more than V2 in verb and particle. And this relation is reversed for verb and preposition. Considering the ratio of V2 to P2, then this ratio should be greater in verb and preposition than in verb and particle under broad focus. Now the research question asks about narrow focus. If an intermediate phrase must contain some pitch accent, then there should be no intermediate phrasing postfocally. And the ratio of V2 to P2 should not be significantly greater in verb and preposition than in verb and particle postfocally. So bearing these predictions in mind, I ran one linear mixed effects model with the same fixed effects and random effects as before. And now the dependent variable is log of the ratio of V2 to P2. I chose the log because V2 to P2 itself is not normally distributed. And again, I dummy coded focus. So I'm most interested in the main effect on syntax here for the post-focal context. Let's look at the results for the second question. The prediction is under broad focus, ratio of V2 to P2 is greater in verb and preposition than in verb and particle. And this is indeed the case. Specifically, the ratio in verb and particle is 70% of the ratio in verb and preposition. Now, postfocally, if an intermediate phrase must contain some pitch accent, then we shouldn't see any significant difference in the ratio across syntactic conditions. Contrary to this prediction, we still see the same difference in the same direction. And specifically, V2 to P2 is in verb and particle is 78% of V2 to P2 in verb and preposition. This suggests that relative strength of phrase boundaries is preserved postfocally. To discuss, the answer to the first research question was post-prominence distinctions seem to be neutralized postfocally, suggesting that with the removal of pitch accent, we don't see realizations of phrasal stress either. This is consistent with the view that phrasal prominence is realized through pitch accent only. Now, the answer to the second research question is, postfocally, the relative degree of phrase boundaries is preserved, as is indicated by different degrees of lengthening effects on the pre-boundary rhymes. Assuming these phrase boundaries are intermediate phrase boundaries, this suggests that there is no postfocal dephrasing. This is consistent with the view that prosodic phrasing follows syntactic phrasing and is not affected by focus. Since focus doesn't affect syntactic phrasing, at least in English, prosodic phrasing shouldn't be affected either. Thank you for your attention.